I would echo the campus point in that anybody who is getting depressed about the world ought to come work on campus, and it's just it's an instant injection of hope for the future because people are like, oh, this generation they're just on TikTok. That is not what I see. I see these like bright young minds who care about their world and want to do great things.
Welcome to Anchor Change, where we help you panic responsibly in a chaotic world. I'm Katy Harbath. I've navigated impossible trade-offs in tech, politics, and my personal life for decades. I know that can be lonely. As a Midwesterner who spent 20 years in Silicon Valley and DC, it's taken me a while to figure it out. I still am. One thing that helps me is hearing the stories of other people forging their own paths. Because in a world of complexity, you don't have to navigate it alone. Welcome to Anchor Change. Hi, welcome to Anchor Change. I'm your host, Katy Harbath. I'm really excited about today's conversation because I'm bringing together two people that one works in tech ethics. His name's Rob Reich at Stanford. And then Katy Culver, who is the head of the journalism school at UW-Madison, runs the Center for Journalism Ethics. She was my second journalism teacher after Professor Hoyt. But she is the one that has taught me and got me into the internet from the very beginning and has really been a guiding force for me since I've left UW about how to try to navigate this tricky intersection of ethics and tech and journalism. And I was at UW this fall for a board meeting, and I realized that I wanted to have a conversation with Rob and Katy. Rob coming from the tech ethics side and the philosophy side, and Katy coming at it from the journalism side, because these two worlds are colliding so much. And so I wanted to bring them together in conversation so that we could further explore how these two industries that are so impacted on one another might start to think about better working together. So I hope you enjoy. Rob and Katy, welcome to Anchor Change. Thanks for joining me.
Really great to
Thanks
be
for
here.
having her.
So I've had the honor of being taught by both of you at very different times in my life. Katy, you're one of my first professors at UW in journalism, and Rob, I was able to take your tech ethics class, both as a practitioner when I was at Facebook, but then also being a cohort leader and many other things. And I wanted to bring you two together because I realized when I was at UW-Madison this fall that how much these two worlds and the question of ethics are really colliding. But to set the foundation, I wanted to ask each of you to share a little bit more about your work and the classes and stuff that you're working on. So Katy, we'll start with you. Can you share a bit more about what you're doing as the head of the journalism school at UW, but then also particularly the Center for Journalism Ethics?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Katy. I really swell with pride to see you and all the tremendous work that you're doing, and really how much you center integrity in your work. It's really,
Thank you.
it makes an old professor proud. So in our Center for Journalism Ethics, we certainly do focus on industry practices. One of the things that we spend a lot of time doing now is helping people who aren't within the bounds of traditional newsrooms think about how to get the support they need to be making choices that they can justify. Because we have a lot more people who are doing work outside of the kind of newsrooms that I grew up in, and grew up in professionally. I wasn't covering breaking news at age 5. But when you have people who see themselves as content creators, but their audience might think that what they're doing is journalistic, how do they think about this? And what kinds of supports can we give them? And then, of course, also within the School of Journalism and Mass Communication, we're thinking about how to help students tackle this ever-changing world. When I started in this job, I had a wonderful boss, the director at the time. Her name was Sharon Dunwoody. And on my first day, she sat me down and she said, Katy, we need you to train students for jobs that do not yet exist.
And
Okay,
I'm an
Sharon.
example of that because I worked 10 years at a company that didn't exist when I graduated in '03.
Exactly. And I said, well, that's, really a very small challenge that you've given me, but it gave me the right mindset, which is I need to help students get comfortable with adaptability. You're not learning a set of skills now that you will start using tomorrow, and that's going to carry you through. What you're learning is a growth mindset that you're going to be able to tackle challenges as they arise. And I think there's nothing that reinforces that better than what we're facing today with AI and the challenges that arise. I mean, I'm going to be honest. pretty much every morning I open a Substack that makes me want to retire rather than retool everything that I'm doing. My work and so I'm very much integrated in my research, teaching, and public outreach through the Center for Journalism Ethics. And my work right now is really focused on two areas. So when it comes to freedom of expression, in the United States, we have very much an individualistic conception of that. And I focus on where rights meet responsibilities. And we think of that in an antagonistic sense, rights versus responsibilities. I don't think it has to be that way. I think they can be complementary. And then also, I think we have been a bit ill-served by an ethic of independence in journalism, of seeing ourselves separate and apart from the communities that we serve. And I think we might be better served by an ethic of interdependence. And so, thinking about that and exploring that is something I'm focused on now.
Thanks. Rob, how about you? Can you share a bit more about your work at Stanford? And particularly, I'd love to know a little bit more about the impetus of creating the tech and ethics class for practitioners and how that's evolved over the last, what, 5, 6, 7 years? I'm not sure how long.
5 or 6 years at
Yeah.
this point. That's right. So I'm a philosopher by training, and I've had the good fortune of being a faculty member at Stanford now for almost 30 years. And as you can imagine, I've seen the campus in certain respects transform in front of my very eyes over the course of those 3 decades. When I first began teaching at Stanford, the most popular majors on campus were economics, political science, history, even English was in the top 10. And of course, in the early 2000s, and then especially in 2010 and beyond, computer science and the School of Engineering and STEM fields, began to take over the vast majority of student interest. So I found myself in the 2010s, especially as the tech companies in Silicon Valley grew ever larger and more consequential, finding myself wanting to collaborate with people over in the computer science department in order to try to bring a broader, call it social or ethical frame to the incredible toolkit that the computer science students learn here at Stanford and then go out and make a mark in the world through the digital revolution. I was worried that technical skills alone weren't going to be enough to think about the broader social consequences and responsibilities. And of course, once the Cambridge Analytica scandal happened and the Russian interference on the Facebook platform in 2016 became known, the concerns that I had were hardly eccentric, and many, many people began worrying about the broader consequences, intended or unintended, of the big tech platforms and our social media era. So the collaborations that I did with people were designed to try to integrate ethics, policy, and technical skills all in the same class, rather than thinking that, you just tell students at Stanford to take an ethics class sometime during the course of their studies, and it's like just checking a little tick box on some curricular pathway. I began teaching with the Mehran Sahami, who's my colleague at Stanford, now the chair of the computer science department, who has long taught the introduction to computer science class at Stanford. Along with another colleague who had served in the Obama administration, we developed a new course on ethics, policy, and technological change. Became quite popular over the course of a couple of years. We ended up writing a book out of the material during the pandemic. And then, Katy, as you just mentioned, when I was at home during the pandemic, we decided to launch a version of this class online for people in the tech industry, striving now to reach not only the student population at Stanford, but people within the tech industry with this broader kind of frame for thinking about the incredible power that people have with technical skills in Silicon Valley companies.
Can you share a bit more about the class and sort of, because you do combine philosophy, and I love how you always start with the story of the
Yeah,
Omelas, which you can maybe
sure.
talk a little bit about, but what does that mean exactly for folks that might be like, well, tech ethics could cover a whole bunch of different things. What frameworks are you trying to give the students in that class?
Yeah, well, so sometimes I say to people that when a philosopher shows up in a kind of STEM field or a technical environment, the worry is that the philosopher has just arrived to wag a finger at the technologist and say, maybe you should think before you act, or slow down, and rather than rushing and everything out, the classic think fast and break things style
Move
approach.
fast and break things. Yeah.
Move fast and break things. Yeah, maybe thinking fast also.
Yeah.
But in any case, the basic idea is that one shouldn't outsource ethics to some other body, especially if you think of ethics as just nothing more than legal compliance. And, in addition, I don't think it's especially good organizational or corporate practice to have, a chief ethics officer as if that team can function as the ethical conscience of the entire company. Instead, all of us have ethical concerns and questions to confront in any kind of work that we do, and then especially within tech companies because their products are used by millions and even billions of people. So thinking about the responsible design and diffusion of these products is of paramount importance. And so people all the way at the beginning of the tech stack in the product development line have a set of broader responsibilities to think about the various ways in which their designs could be used, both for good and for ill. And I think of this mainly as a question of professional ethics rather than personal ethics. Like, yes, of course, anyone should have a personal moral compass that guides their actions. But we're talking here about a set of professional norms and standards and responsibilities that ought to be developed within the tech industry, and that which aspirationally reach back into the very training of the technologist in the university setting, which is, of course, where I mainly practice my trade, as it were. Last thing here, just to mention and explain to people this class that you took and that's still going. Actually, tonight is the last of this year's version of that class for practitioners. The class begins with a reading of a short story by the magnificent fantasy writer Ursula Le Guin called "The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas." And Omelas is a utopian town. This is only a 6 or 7 page story. It's very simple to read and easy to get your mind around. It's a utopia in which the town's utopian nature is all premised on a single child being imprisoned in a kind of dungeon-like cell in the city. And every year, to celebrate Omelas's great happiness, the town has a festival, and during festival day, every single citizen of Omelas has to acknowledge the existence of their happiness, it being dependent upon the misery of this one child. And the story ends with an acknowledgement that on every single year on festival day, some people decide to walk away from Omelas. And in the course of then discussing this story, the main thing that I hope to stimulate in people is thinking about whether or not, if in the face of something that you believe to be unjust, do you try to fight from within the system to change it, as it were, fight within Omelas to do something about the injustice in front of your eyes? Or if in walking away, what possibilities are there to fight for a better world from outside the system? So do you stay to fight, or do you leave and take a position from outside the structure that you're trying to change? And I feel like, as I've taught this story partly to people in the tech world, thinking about whether to stay and fight from within or fight from without to create, a more responsible deployment of digital tools and platforms and technology, the kind of broader lessons of this story have often emerged in discussion to be a parable about, say, I live in Ukraine and I have to decide whether to stay here or to leave the country. Or this is a story that reflects my own immigrant journey of leaving my homeland in order to try to improve the condition of my family by leaving and doing something elsewhere. And so I just find the story has incredible power and resonance across a whole variety of topics, all within the space of just 6 pages.
I also love, too, how it's not an easy answer about what to do.
Yep.
Which just always really resonated with me. And I found it to be a great way of introducing people who have not been inside of a tech company, but are tech adjacent, whether in civil society or NGOs or government, in trying to decide that. I also, in rereading the story, both when I was inside the company and outside the company, I now see it from both perspectives.
Yes.
About where there's benefits of being on the inside, but also the power that you can have on the outside. And again, there's not necessarily one right answer. It's sort of thinking through those trade-offs of where you think you can have the right impact that you want to be having at that moment in time. And I'm curious, Rob, though, like, I have to imagine that, at least I've also noticed, how people are approaching the ethics and maybe how they're thinking about it has evolved over the last 5 years. Can you share some of the themes that you've seen? How has the class changed and how they're thinking about these issues?
Yeah, I mean, one of the most prominent changes is the fact that, back when you took the class, it was, shortly in the wake of, the kind of Google protests internally about Project Maven and Google walkout, and the sense in which people who worked within tech companies had significant leverage or at least power to help shape and even influence the decisions of leadership. And these days, through broadly our changing domestic politics and evolution of the tech industry, I think it's much more difficult for there to be vocal opposition from within an employee base, at least in a kind of open and transparent way. To say the obvious here, Google has not merely kind of changed its orientation to its work, but formally announced that it will happily make various contracts with the U.S. military. Something that Project Maven was a pretty early and minor part of a broader contract that generated so much outrage. And so these days, I think the kind of leverage that employees have in tech companies, unless you are one of the 100 leading AI developers in the world, where people are competing over your employment terms with millions and millions of dollars, the leverage of tech employees now, I think, is generally lower than it was 5 years ago. That's the biggest change. But then, of course, the broader political environment is a much different challenge as well. The sense in which the leadership of the vast majority of big tech companies in Silicon Valley, if not before the election, cozying up to President Trump, at least in the wake of the election, most prominently at the inauguration day, bending the knee, as it were, to acknowledge the difference in power that had taken place in the U.S., presents all kinds of different challenges that was different, and it is a much different environment today than it was 5 years ago and certainly 10 years ago.
Katie, how about in the journalism sector? You mentioned a little bit, but my goodness, the amount of change that's just happened in the last 5 years to the media and everything. How have you seen sort of the evolution of how folks are thinking about ethics in that field?
Well, my goodness. If you want to talk about bending the knee, look, I think so. There's so much to be said, but I want to be really careful not to paint with too broad a brush, because we have to be careful in all areas of ethics to do what Rob just pointed out earlier, which is to think about our kind of individual morality separately from our professional role-based morality, and then, or excuse me, ethics, and then different from institutional level ethics. And so when we're thinking about something as distressing as the Paramount settlement with Donald Trump, for instance, and it is indeed distressing. That is incredibly different from the work that's being done by journalists at 60 Minutes. I am really not at all concerned about the ethical decision making that's going on within those roles. But I am concerned about the institutional decision making, the corporate decision making by ABC Disney, by Paramount. And I also am concerned by the lack of public pressure in response to some of what the administration has done. And that in the past, when there have been forces that seriously threaten the public's right to know, there has been uproar over it. And in this case, if you look at, well, up until Jimmy Kimmel gave me a ray of hope. But up until Jimmy Kimmel, all of the furor over the settlement, the Disney settlement and the Paramount settlement, was aimed at Disney and Paramount. It was not aimed at a president who was forcing the bending of the knee. And that is a change. That is different from what we would have heard during the Nixon administration. Although I will note I was a small child at that time. um, and so I think the media critiques have been powerful and are necessary. It is important that we question that institutional level ethics, but it is also important that we question the ethics of others in power. And I think when we focus too much on tech ethics or journalism ethics, we're forgetting to hold to account people who ought to be held to account. And so journalism ethics ain't just for journalism anymore. Tech ethics ain't just for technologists anymore. But people with tremendous power and influence ought to be held to standards of truthfulness. They ought to be held to standards of minimizing harm. I'm fine with a politician being out there to persuade, being out there to win an election, but I'm not fine with lying. So I think that is a change that we have accepted more. I would say bald-faced lying than I thought we would have accepted in the public sphere in the past. I do think that for you asked specifically about students and younger people, I do think that sort of wave of, in tech, engineers were harder to come by than young engineers were harder to come by than young reporters. And so they they had a little bit more power to say disagree with the corporate decisions that you're making. And so we want you to divest from whatever contract it is. But you certainly saw a lot of push and pull over, say, the murder of George Floyd, for instance, with, younger staff really pushing on NPR or PBS or the New York Times or the Washington Post saying, wait a minute, what are you talking about? Like we need to stand strong in this way. I had a situation where a public radio staffer and his public radio boss both contacted me within minutes of each other over an issue of him having Black Lives Matter in a social media profile. And him contacting me to say, can you believe that my boss says that this is a political statement? And her contacting me to say, can you believe he does not recognize that this is a political statement? It's just it's a very interesting dichotomy. And I do see a little bit less of that, confrontation now. But I will say the young people that I encounter in my classrooms now, they are more questioning of the idea of neutrality in journalism. They really wrestle with that concept that, when we believe something is wrong, should we be neutral? And it's that personal morality that they're struggling with up against the professional role ethics, that this is the expectation. Neutrality is the expectation, and yet it feels personally wrong to you. I hear a lot of that wrestling in my classrooms.
And how do you all talk through that? Like, how are you helping them to kind of work through that?
It's interesting. You've heard me. I bet you actually heard this in my classroom. I know you've heard it in our board meetings. But we talk about the complexity of right and wrong. It's very talk about truth as if it exists in some really big, broad way, and it doesn't. It just doesn't. There are very few objective truths. And what I talk about is, we can talk about whether it's raining. And, we can look out the window. So let's say Rob and let's say we're both in Madison, Wisconsin. And I can look out the window and I can say, is it raining? Yes or no? Is that true or false? And if Rob and I happen to be in the same place, looking out the same window, we can both observe whether it's raining and agree whether it is true or false because we can see with our own eyes. That is an example of an objective truth. But if Rob is not here and he has to rely on me to observe whether it's raining or not, I may be believable, I may not. And then there become the questions of how hard is it raining? Who is affected by the rain? What caused the rain? Is the rain getting worse because of global climate change? I mean, all of these dimensions, you can very, very firmly believe that this rainstorm is the worst rainstorm that we have ever experienced in Madison, Wisconsin, because the climate is changing and rain events are getting far more serious. And I believe that to be true. And I have to report on that. And it is wrong if I don't do that. It is immoral if I do not do that. That is not the case for everybody in your audience. And so that's how we talk about it with them. That ultimately, ethics is not about a rubber stamp of right and wrong, true or not true. I wish it was, and that I was smart enough to be able to wield that rubber stamp. I'd get paid a lot more money. It's not. Ethics is about the reasoning that you go through to be able to justify your decisions to the people who are affected by those decisions.
Well, this is where I'd love to bring the tech and the journalism together, because now with feeds, and we've had feeds for a long time now, technologists are playing the role of deciding what is being weighed in what way to help show you what content is appearing in those feeds. the front page has long been sort of a bygone era where that you're deciding what the top 5 or 6 stories of the day are that you want to be putting up there. Rob, I'll start with you if that's okay. But curious, where do you see the intersection of these two worlds, and how are you seeing it manifest in your work as people are trying to figure out, like, let's take the true or not true out of it, but just like what content should people be shown?
Sure, that's fantastic, and hearing Katy describe this is so resonant with some of my own experiences, and I want to think productively illuminates where our minds have been for the past 10 or 15 minutes, which is the interface between personal ethics and personal morality, professional or institutional ethics that attend to a profession. In this case, we're talking about journalistic or media ethics, and then broader social or political ethics, the kinds of things that bind us together as citizens of a broader whole. And you know, hear, hearing Katy describe, the objective fact of whether it's raining outside, but the subjective experience of things that don't, easily give the label truth or falsity. And so much of what happens in media and journalism falls not within the realm of fact or not fact, true or false, but within this broader range. It just illuminates again for me the significance of professional and institutional ethics. So for example, Katy, take what you just described, the feed that's replaced the so-called front page of the newspaper or old style journalism. Well, how did we get to the front page orientation of old style media? That came about through an evolution and maturation of the norms that bound people together as serious journalists. And so, for example, in the wake of, the so-called yellow journalism industry era, there was an effort to separate out the role of the publisher from the role of the editor. The publisher should have no sort of entry point into deciding anything about the editorial content. There was supposed to be some separation of the house, as it were. And that's a reflection not of a law that was passed in the country, but just of a norm that was broadly understood to be an essential part of the fourth estate and its healthy operation in a democracy. Well, that type of professional maturation has not yet happened in our new social media, inflected ecosystem. If people have left behind ordinary forms of receiving news and information from, the old style media, and now get it predominantly from algorithmically driven feeds, those decisions, algorithmic or by the people in the tech industry, are not driven by a sense of the professional norms and responsibilities that attach to media and journalism, but rather by fairly ordinary profit-making activities that try to capture people's attention and sell them advertising in order to make a dollar. I don't want to describe that as somehow evil. It's not. It's the ordinary operation of the incentive structure in a for-profit marketplace, but one in which people have been blinded to the sense in which there could be an alternative set of professional or institutional norms insofar as they are now the front door of information for the vast majority of people. And I think the reluctance or even refusal to rise to the level of maturity and understanding how it is that tech companies now are the media front door for the vast majority of people, under 50, has been reflects their steadfast refusal to think more broadly about the professional responsibilities that attach to that gargantuan and essential role that they now serve.
Katy, on the journalism side, I remember a conversation we had in one of our board meetings that I found fascinating, where one of our members was talking about the challenge journalists have because you want to be publishing stuff that gets a lot of clicks. But it's not necessarily the investigative journalism or things that people should be getting. How are you seeing journalists and the media also grapple with this algorithmic environment that we're all living in?
Algorithms took the worst lesson of journalism and put it on steroids times a million. I did not say that in a great way. Like, I wish I could get that soundbite back. But look, we've always known that there's been a problem with conflict in journalism. We overemphasize conflict in journalism. It's been proven by
If it bleeds, it leads.
Yes, if the countless research studies, some of them done by my own colleagues, Mike Wagner, who you've worked with, Katy, it's been a problem. we cover crime because it's conflict. And then because we realized in tech that conflict sells, it drives more enragement, drives engagement. So people stick around longer and we make more money off of it. Algorithms were optimized to reward that content. And so now we are in a world where that is just baked into the system. So even if you have an investigative journalism piece or series that you really want people to take up, if you do A/B testing where the headline emphasizes conflict, my guess is you will do better in uptake of that story. And that's really sad if you're talking about wanting a if you're talking about wanting a public sphere where we encourage cooperation, where we encourage building across difference to come to solutions that are acceptable to broad swaths of society. Conflict drives societies down. It does not build them up. And so when we have realized that we profit from conflict rather than profiting from cooperation, ultimately we're making money off of what's going to drive us to extinction. I mean, it sounds like an overstatement, but ultimately it's not. It's like we will polarize ourselves to death. We'll get rich doing it, but then what do we have ultimately in the end?
How do you feel about the alternative that I've been seeing from some media orgs like Semaphore and Axios and others who are trying to, or even New York Times, where they're trying to make money off of events or cooking or games, or I think USA Today hired a Taylor Swift correspondent to try to like find other ways to bring in traffic that might then fund the journalism that's not sexy but is important.
I think one of the most interesting aspects of that, Katie, is that you have identified almost everything that you did besides the Taylor Swift correspondent, although it includes the Taylor Swift correspondent, is you've identified in-person efforts. And I think one of the really fascinating ones to watch is the Minnesota Star Tribune, used to be the Minneapolis Star
Yeah,
Tribune.
Steve Grove had I had him on the show this summer.
Yeah, they've got a new innovation editor, also a graduate of your School of Journalism and Mass Communication, and they're really relying on in-person events. And I think the bet is that geographic community is needs to make a comeback because again, if we are going to come together to solve common problems, and those problems tend to be local, it is the in-person connection that we ultimately need. It's not the conflict that's been driven. We're always going to have community conflict. It's always going to exist. We are going to differ. We're going to differ on politics. We're going to differ on money. We're going to differ on safety. Well, that's always going to be there. But I think those bets that people are making on in-person events are bets on community bringing us together rather than conflict driving us apart.
Katie, if you gave me a lot of advice when I was at Facebook and many advice over the years about many, many, many different things. But if I were to come to you and been like, hey, I have the magic wand, Mark's listening to me no matter whatever I say and how we think about the algorithms, I might be asking, it's a big question I know to ask, but like there's a lot of people inside the companies who are really trying to figure out how to do the right thing. And there's just not an easy answer of what the right thing is. And they're trying to think about how to think about news. They're trying to think about different ways of doing this. What are the frameworks that you're asking them to at least think through, or the questions you're asking them to think through when they're building that?
Oh, Rob, why did I
Easy
get this
question.
one?
Well, he's getting his
That's all
next.
for you. That's all yours, Katie.
Wow. Wow. Okay. Well, actually, so I'm not going to answer it. I'm going to have John Rawls answer it. So I'm going to my favorite philosopher. So here's the thing. To me, if you're ultimately going to make a good choice, you've a choice that's defensible to people who are affected by it, you have to take your self-interest out of it. And to me, that means you have to put yourself in the position of the people who are going to be affected by it. And so one of the reasons that Rawls' theory of justice is the thing that I rely on a lot, and the thing that I go back to and refer to a lot, is that, this idea that you make a choice not knowing which group you're going to end up in. There are multiple groups that are going to be affected by your decision. You make the decision, but you don't know which group you're in the end. So you have to decide on a system that awards funding, education funding based on race, but you don't know whether you are black or white in the end. Boy, that's going to be a fair funding system, isn't it? It's going to be equal because you don't know which group you end up in. And it's, the hypothetical that I always turn to with students is, if you're trapped on a desert island and you come upon this treasure chest and it's you and one other person and you have to divide up the treasure between you, but it's not exactly, the things differ in size, they differ in value, whatever. The ultimate fair way to do it is one person splits it in two and the other person gets first choice of the half. Like, then you're going to split it exactly equally because the other person gets to pick first. To me, if you are setting up an algorithm or you are making choices within a company, you have to think about the effects of those choices and you have to think about how they would affect you, whichever group you end up in. And I think, unfortunately, because so much of it is commodified, that we're often thinking about the groups are consumers. So you end up in the group that's like most likely to be converted into a buyer based on what I'm doing. And I understand it. I'm a capitalist. I have no problem. I have no problem with the fact that these are companies that are trying to make money. Like, I'm not an idiot. But if I were going to make those choices, I would make them based on knowing how different sets of people are going to be affected and thinking, if I ended up in this set of people, what would that be like? If I ended up in this set of people, what would that be like? And trying to make the decision based on understanding those outcomes.
Rob, you've had the lucky opportunity to think while Katy has been talking.
Yeah,
Yes.
work to God. It better be better than what I came up with.
Yeah, no, but
Well,
but
I love that I've been opining on, the evolution of the journalism and media industry, and Katy is now treading into political philosophy waters here with John Rawls. So
this is what I wanted to have happen. It's great.
it's a perfect cross-pollination here. Yeah. Well, I mean, these are the essential conversations to have at a broad level of trying to understand what does fairness mean and what would it mean to create the basic building blocks of society, our economic institutions, our political institutions, our social institutions, in a way that might strive for what we would describe as justice or fairness. And Rawls is perhaps the best example we have in the past 100 years of constructing a fairly detailed and elaborate theory to outline the answer to that. And that famous example that Katy just gave of the veil of ignorance, or the original position of not knowing various things about who you would be in society, and then trying to construct the rules for society out of or behind this veil of ignorance, is one great example of trying to reason through that. I guess, for me, the only thing I want to add to this is to say, since things in the early days of the internet, beginning perhaps with Craig Newmark and Craigslist, began to threaten some of the traditional business models of the media industry, in particular of newspapers. I think we've been in a now 20-year, 30-year period of experimentation in trying to reconstruct viable business models that allow us to maintain some of the quality journalism and responsible provision of information to a broad public. And so, simply describing the landscape as I see it, we have nonprofit newsrooms that are philanthropically supported. We have new efforts at for-profit entities that are online only. We have an effort to fill in the gap of local news and local journalism. You were just describing a few examples of those. You have all the live event strategy, whether or not the New York Times Wordle or cooking options are what are supporting the rest of the newsroom at this point. You have efforts at patronage models, the Lorene Powell Jobs or Jeff Bezos versions of subsidizing otherwise for-profit entities, but not expecting them to maximize profit. And this is the transitional phase we're going through in order to try to get to a more stable environment in which providing the news and being a journalist is something for which there can be a stable support system, a stable business environment in which to do it. And we haven't come out the other side yet, which is why continued experimentation and innovation is important. And also, for what it's worth, that's among the reasons I think the big tech companies that have not merely partly displaced the role of traditional news and media in providing information for people, but also are responsible in some form or fashion for the changing advertising environment and business model. So it gives the tech platforms a moral as well as fiscal responsibility for some of this experimentation. And whether or not it's through the algorithms that deliver the information through their products or various forms of partnerships with news and media industries. These are important experiments that people should continue to undertake and, deserve the widest possible kind of social pressure tests. And, I'd be especially curious for Katie to point out anything she thinks is worthy of our collective attention in addition to what's going on up there in Minnesota.
Yeah, I mean, of course, you're exactly right, Rob, that there's a lot of experimentation going on. I think there is concern, including my own concern, that some of what we're doing is trying to prop up business models that may not have a right to continue to exist. So it may not be that the ink on paper local news outlet for profit model should continue in a town the size of mine, for instance. I don't know. I don't know. I don't have the answer to that particular question. I do think you mentioned Craig Newmark, and I think he's an interesting case because you're right. The list that he created decimated. It just took, I mean, local news had a three-legged revenue stool and he just sawed off one leg. They weren't ready for it and it destroyed the business model. He's been very self-reflective about that, and he has put a lot of philanthropy back into journalism. I haven't seen that with the buzzsaw that went at the other legs of the revenue stool by other tech companies. I haven't seen the institutional ethical reasoning and reflection that came at display advertising and subscriptions. And so I haven't seen social media companies, and I haven't seen, well, really Google for search, have that same kind of thought about sort of a civic responsibility of encouraging consumption of reliable information. And I
Yeah,
think
can I add a
what
quick story about that? I think you're right to point to the efforts that Craig Newmark has made in his philanthropic work to try to take stock of some of the, effect that his Craigslist had on news and the business model there. I remember early in my days as a professor at Stanford when I would wander over to, go to some of the tech events that happened on campus. At some point, Craig Newmark was a guest and was a speaker at some workshop or conference. And I recall the introduction that was made of him as he came to the microphone was basically that, now we're going to hear from Craig Newmark, the technologist who single-handedly destroyed the business model of newspapers. And then everyone applauded him for having done so. And he looked just pained when he arrived at the microphone, because I thought he seemed to understand that this idea of being a creative disruptor, which is so championed by, an ordinary tech ethos, has unintended or even intended consequences sometimes that when you break things, they're hard to put back together. And I agree with you, Katie, that with the efforts he's made philanthropically to confront some of the effects of Craigslist are not matched by other of the big tech entities or, for that matter, CEOs.
I do think it's interesting how there are folks like Substack that are trying to find different models as a tech company as well to be thinking about this and what it means for independent journalists to own their lists and everything else like that. But there's challenges there, subscription fatigue, working on your own, not having an editor, all those other things that are also happening as part of this. I also think, Katie, to your point about local news, like if I were giving some advice to some students, I'd be like, go back to your hometown, start a newsletter, go cover the local high school sports, go cover the city council, use video, AI, like all the tools that you can use in which to create this content and fill some of those gaps to try to see if there's ways of sort of reconstituting what's happening at the local level in a way that doesn't require as much overhead as like your standard print edition used to be. And I want to, that's one of the things that gives me hope and gives me some optimism around this is sort of the innovation that is coming from not just younger generations, but all sorts of different folks who are trying to kind of figure this out. And I want to end on that optimistic note. So, Rob, because I made Katy go first on the hard question, I'm going to make you go first on this one. But what gives you hope right now as you think about the next couple of years? It is a very challenging time, but I also think I'm hopeful. Where are you seeing hope? Let's end on a good note.
Yeah, super. All right. Well, I'll say two things. I mean, as a philosopher, one of our alleged superpowers, if we have any at all, is to contest the question that's been asked of us. So I'm going to be an irritable guest on your show here by saying I generally tend to avoid the invitation to say, well, at the end of the day, am I an optimist or a pessimist, or please give us give us an expression of hope. In part because the orientation that I think is the appropriate one to bring is what others have described as optimism of the will and skepticism of the intellect. And we should not turn our brains off in analyzing all the various reasons why things are challenging or worse, but we should still find a way to engage our will and make efforts to improve our social conditions. So that's my general framework. Now, to give you a really concrete answer to your question, Katy, where do I find some hope? Well, number one, I always remind myself that the change that we expect to see within 1 year, we reliably kind of over project, and we seem to be disappointed. But the change that we predict can happen within 10 years, we reliably undershoot that. And, if you just go back in time 10 years from today to November of 2015, we hadn't yet even had the revelations of Russia's interference in Facebook and what kicked off some of the, early parts of the tech clash. We're in such a different moment 10 years later, obviously with AI at the forefront of our minds. And I think the geopolitical terms have reshaped how it is we think about big tech, because now we're in a geopolitical competition with China. We find ourselves in various ways of deep uncertainty about AI timelines and the potential enormous benefits alongside maybe even existential risks or catastrophic risks. This is where our collective energy, I think, needs to be directed as we try to imagine ways of aligning the AI revolution with the greatest ideals of democracy and freedom and equality. And I feel like we're in the early phases of this, and I have a lot of confidence that in 10 years, our democratic institutions will have risen to their responsibilities, and younger generations that I get a chance to see regularly on campus feel the energy to contribute to this. And it's appropriate we're recording this on election day here in the United States, and the kind of vibrant turnout that I'm expecting is just one reflection of this much greater engagement in the younger generation that I see on campus as well.
I love that. And your first part of your answer really goes towards my little panic responsibly mantra, because I agree with you that like there's things that we can't, it's not just one or the other, but it's how we balance the two and think about both. Katy, I'm going to give you the final word. Doesn't necessarily have to just be optimism, but sort of final thoughts of sort of how you're thinking about the coming years.
Yeah, I would echo the campus point in that anybody who is getting depressed about the world ought to come work on a campus, and it's just it's an instant injection of hope for the future, because people are like, oh, this generation, they're just on TikTok. That is not what I see. I see these like bright young minds who care about their world and want to do great things. I am like I wax and wane between tremendous optimism about AI and tremendous fear of AI. But honestly, I think the thing that probably has me the most hopeful right now actually goes back to the pandemic. I was really afraid in the early going of the pandemic, and I was on Facebook one day, and there was a little meme, and it was a stemless wine glass, which is an abomination, right? You should never have a stemless wine glass. They shouldn't exist, right? But had a little, it was half full of Chardonnay. It said, Optimist, that's half full. Pessimist, that's half empty. 2020, that's P, isn't it? And I I laughed, but then I thought that's human creativity. That is, we are in this moment of existential dread, and that is human creativity coming forward and reassuring us that we can laugh, we can find commonality, we can find common cause together. So every time we see someone, using AI to create a critique of AI art, using a new form of using a Substack to do a media critique of old media, using something to call out tech ethics. I mean, I just have such enormous faith in the power of human creativity and human hope that it makes me hopeful.
Well, thank you both, Katie and Rob. I really enjoyed this conversation. I appreciate you joining me.
Thank you
It was
so much for having us.
wonderful.
I want to thank Rob and Katie for joining us. I really enjoyed that conversation, and there was so much that we didn't even get to. We didn't even start to touch on AI and copyright and so many issues that are a part of this. But I think that one of the main reasons that I wanted to have this conversation and what I appreciate coming out of the conversation is the understanding that these are not clear answers, that the concept of ethics is tough. It does have trade offs, but there's also ways for us to be thinking about it and grounding ourselves in the decisions that we're trying to make about the information we consume, the content that we create, who we're holding accountable when it comes to some of these decisions, and the information ecosystem that we want. And so I hope that you had some great takeaways from this as well. Please certainly let me know in the comments. Don't forget that I write about a lot of this on anchorchange.substack.com. So I invite you to come and join me there and share any of your thoughts. But until next time, make sure you keep panic responsibly.